You know, it's pretty wild to think that a single sentence, written almost 2,000 years ago, could be a linchpin in a debate that has spanned centuries. Well, today we're putting one of those verses under the microscope, Acts 17:11. It's a key piece of evidence in a massive theological dispute, so let's jump right in.
So our whole investigation really centers on a group of people in the ancient city of Berea and how they reacted when the Apostle Paul showed up to preach. Everything, and I mean everything, hinges on how you read their actions, which are described in this one famous verse.
And there it is. On the surface, it seems simple enough, right? The Bereans are getting praised for what they did. But what exactly is being praised here? Is it their open-minded attitude, or is it their specific theological method? The answer to that question, well, it has some absolutely massive implications.
And that is the billion-dollar question. For a lot of people, this verse is the smoking gun, the definitive proof for the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, the idea that the Bible and the Bible alone is the one and only infallible authority for Christians. But is the case really that open and shut?
Okay, so first, let's unpack how this verse became such a cornerstone for the Scripture alone position. For many Protestant thinkers and apologists, what the Bereans did isn't just a one-off story, it's a divinely inspired blueprint for how all Christians should approach their faith.
So here's how the logic goes, and it's actually powerful in its simplicity. First, you've got the idea that Scripture is the final authority. I mean, think about it. The Bereans are testing the words of an apostle, Paul himself, against the written Scriptures. That seems to put Scripture at the very top of the pyramid. And second, there's sufficiency. They appealed only to Scripture. They didn't consult a council of elders or some ancient tradition. This implies that the Bible is enough. It's all you need.
All right, but that's just one side of the coin. Critics of this view argue that it kind of zooms in so much on this one verse that it misses some really crucial details, both in the text and in the wider context. So let's flip it around and look at the counter-arguments, because this is where the picture gets a lot more complex.
Okay, so here's the first big problem that gets raised. The scriptures that the Bereans were examining, well, that had to be the Old Testament, right? The New Testament simply hadn't been written yet. So if you take this verse to prove Sola Scriptura, then logically it only proves it for the Old Testament. And that's a position that, well, no Christian group out there actually holds.
And then you have to ask, what was the word they received? The verse says they received it with all eagerness. And notice, that's before they even started checking the scrolls. That word was Paul's preaching, his oral teaching. In Catholic terms, that's apostolic tradition. So far from rejecting oral teaching, the verse says they welcomed it with open arms as their starting point.
So, what happened after they used the Old Testament to confirm that Jesus really was the Messiah? Did they stop there? Nope. They accepted the entire Christian faith that Paul was teaching them. This included brand new revelations and practices like Christian baptism and the Eucharist, things that you just won't find spelled out in the Old Testament.
So what this really all boils down to is a key distinction between harmony and sufficiency. What the Bereans were doing, this argument goes, was checking for harmony, making sure this new revelation from Paul fit with the old revelation they already had. It proves the New Testament fulfills the Old, but it doesn't prove that the Old Testament was sufficient all by itself.
You know, to really get what's going on, we have to pull the camera back a bit. Luke, the author of Acts, didn't just drop this story in at random. He's intentionally setting up a direct comparison between what happened in Berea and what just happened in the last town Paul visited, Thessalonica.
I mean, right before showing up in Berea, Paul was literally run out of town. His message in Thessalonica was met with intense jealousy, riots, and a violent mob that forced him and his team to escape in the middle of the night. It was a seriously hostile situation.
And this chart just lays it out so clearly. The main contrast Luke is drawing isn't about two different ways of interpreting the Bible, it's about two totally different attitudes. The Thessalonians were prejudiced and hostile, the Bereans were open-minded and eager. The whole point is about their character, their posture towards the truth.
And this all clicks into place when you look at the specific word Luke used, noble. In Greek, the word is eugenes. Now, it originally meant someone of noble birth. But by this time, it had also come to mean something about your character. It meant being fair-minded, open to reason, and willing to learn. A perfect way to describe the Bereans, and the exact opposite of the rioters in Thessalonica.
Okay, so we've dug into the text, we've looked at the arguments and the counter-arguments, but why all this fuss? Why does the interpretation of one little verse matter so much? Well, because the stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about the very foundations of how different Christian traditions understand truth and authority.
See, Sola Scriptura isn't just an idea for the Protestant Reformation, it's one of its two foundational pillars. To challenge the biblical basis for it is to question the very bedrock of Protestantism itself.
This table really just nails the fundamental disagreement. It all comes down to the source of authority and the central question you ask. For the Sola Scriptura viewpoint, the ultimate test is, where is that in the Bible? But for the Catholic view, the question is broader. Is this consistent with everything the apostles taught, which they believe comes through Scripture, tradition, and the Church all working together?
And here's where things take a fascinating, almost ironic twist. Critics of the Sola Scriptura reading of this verse point out that the hostile Thessalonians, the ones Luke is criticizing, were the ones who rejected Paul's new oral teaching because it didn't line up with their interpretation of the scriptures they already had. In a strange way, they were the ones acting more like modern adherents of Scripture alone.
So, the case of the noble Bereans leaves us at this incredible crossroads. On one hand, the verse is a powerful endorsement of using Scripture to test teaching. But on the other hand, the context seems to suggest their real nobility was in their open-hearted reception of an oral apostolic tradition. And that leads us to one final mind-bending question. If the rule is that every Christian doctrine must be proven by Scripture alone, can the doctrine of Scripture alone meet its own test? It's a challenging thought that sits right at the heart of this centuries-old debate.